Solo camping on Lake Michigan shore. I decided to go solo camping on the shore of Lake Michigan for a weekend getaway. The site was rustic, situated on a small ridge close to the beach, though I couldn't see the shore from my spot. As night fell, my small fire began to die down, and I was about to turn in when I started hearing strange, wet quacking sounds on the beach. It was like someone was hitting a watermelon with a baseball bat, thudding and hollow. A light appeared over the ridge, scanning the tree line with an eerie glow. After a second, the light went down, and the whacking sounds resumed. Closer this time. The light flickered again, and 3 more beams began to move up and down the beach. Then they vanished. For 15 to 20 minutes, it felt like I was sitting there, knife in hand, waiting for these mysterious figures to come murder me. I later researched and think they were just digging for clams or mussels, but during those creepy moments, it was all too real. Rental cabin in northern Michigan. I decided to rent a cabin in northern Michigan for a week with my sister Tanya. She's a writer who needed a quiet place to work, so the rustic cabin by a small pond surrounded by thick woods was perfect. It was late May, still chilly, but we were too excited to care. Our cottage was the last one down a long dirt road, surrounded by beautiful trails maintained by the owner. On our first day, while unloading our luggage, a young man named Brendan and his mother, Linda, approached us. They owned a house a short distance away and mentioned their father had passed away a few years earlier. I shared that I had lost my husband Josh a few months before, and Brendan gave me a creepy smirk. Linda noticed and politely excused herself and Brendan, leaving us to unpack. The way Brendan looked at me as they walked away was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I went for a walk alone while Tanya focused on her writing. I took the easiest path as suggested by the cabin owner. After about 10 minutes, I heard the sound of a small animal moving through the underbrush, something the size of a rabbit. I paused to listen, and when I did, the rustling stopped. I glanced back and saw a human-like shape in the thicket. Assuming it was Brendan, I kept walking, but then I saw a tree about 30 feet ahead, surrounded by the same thicket. There, crouched on a limb, was Brendan, or what I thought was Brendan. In reality, it wasn't him. It was something else entirely, resembling a deformed humanoid with gray-black skin and sharp features. A day or two later, Tanya and I were on the porch watching the sunset. We heard a wolf howl from across the pond, but moments later, an animal screamed loudly nearby. "What is that?" Tanya exclaimed, pointing to the woods. We saw shrubs shaking and an animal emerge, carrying a baby deer. It was larger than a bear, with thick hair around its neck like a lion's mane, a bald rear, and no visible tail. Its back end set lower than the front, giving it a distorted appearance. The creature approached the fawn, shaking it violently before biting into its midsection. Its teeth were 3 inches long, sharp and jagged. I let out a sound, and the creature turned to me with rusty-colored, illuminated eyes before retreating into the darkness. The next day, we returned to the cabin and shared our experience with Linda, who was genuinely concerned. She seemed shocked but appreciated that we thought to report it. I know it wasn't a Bigfoot, but the encounter remains one of the most unsettling experiences of our lives. Encountered near the summit. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to hike through a remote jungle mountain area. The trail was stunning, with lush vegetation and the sounds of exotic wildlife all around us. After a long day of trekking, we set up camp near the summit, exhausted but exhilarated. That night, as I lay in my tent, I felt an inexplicable presence watching us. The jungle was alive with chirping insects and rustling leaves, but amidst the natural sounds, there was something else, an unsettling energy that I couldn't quite identify. Around midnight, I heard a soft whisper in my native language, right by my ear, saying, "This is not good." I froze, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. My dog, Rex, a vigilant German shepherd, started growling and pacing near the tent entrance. Trying to stay calm, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. The dense darkness offered no clues, but I could sense something moving just beyond the tree line. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A massive dark creature with glowing red eyes. It stood tall, larger than any animal I'd seen, with elongated limbs and a menacing presence. Determined to protect my friends, I quickly called out for them to wake up and leave the campsite immediately. We packed up in a hurry, our hearts pounding with fear as we navigated through the dark jungle, guided only by the dim light of our headlamps. The whispers followed us, echoing through the trees and heightening our anxiety. As we hiked away from the summit, the oppressive feeling lifted, and the jungle sounds returned to normal. We didn't stop until we were safely back at the base, shaken by the encounter but relieved to be out of the haunted summit area. That night remains one of the most unsettling moments of our hiking adventures, a stark reminder that some places hold secrets better left unexplored. Police officers encounter. I was solo camping in a state park campground on a spring weekday, so there weren't many people around. I had just gotten into my tent to read a bit before bed when I heard something odd, an almost Simpson-like howling echoing through the dark. My first thought was Sasquatch, though I don't usually believe in them. The howling grew louder and more persistent, shaking the tent as it pounded against the fabric. I listened intently, trying to make sense of the noise. It sounded almost human but twisted in a way that felt deeply unsettling. Determined to figure out what was going on, I cautiously approached the tent flap. The growling of my dog, a Labrador named Max, intensified, his body tense and ready to defend us. I peeked outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. At first, I saw nothing, just the thick woods surrounding the campground. But then, in the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving swiftly between the trees. It was large, too large to be any normal animal, and it moved with an unnatural grace. Max barked furiously, and I could feel the fear building inside me. I decided to investigate further, quietly unzipping the tent to get a better look. As I stepped outside, the howling ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost tangible. The night air was cold, and I could see my breath misting in the flashlight's beam. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, or something that looked like a man, with pale, clammy skin and long, sharp teeth that glinted in the light. His eyes glowed red, piercing through the darkness with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. He lunged at me with incredible speed, and I barely had time to react. I grabbed Max and ran back to the tent, slamming the flap shut and securing it tightly. Heart pounding, I realized I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. A creature straight out of folklore or nightmare. The howling had been a warning, but it was too late. The creature had already made its presence known, and I knew I had to get out of there as quickly as possible. I spent the rest of the night restless, unable to shake the fear that something was still watching us from the darkness. In the morning, I packed up and left the campground, vowing never to return alone again. The encounter left me shaken and questioning everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. Despite my efforts to rationalize what happened, I can't deny the terrifying reality of that night. A stark reminder that some mysteries are best left unexplored. Memphis police officers encounter. This incident occurred in Memphis, Tennessee, in the 1980s. I had just started my career as a Memphis police officer and was on a special assignment one summer night. It was 2 a.m., a clear, humid evening with no signs of bad weather. I was driving my personal vehicle with the top down, the radio playing softly. I was still in my uniform, complete with my bulletproof vest and a gun belt loaded with all the standard equipment. I was heading south on Covington Pike at a good rate of speed, and I was the only one on the road. This stretch of road connects the Raleigh-Bartlett area to the Berkeley area, running slightly elevated over the Wolf River, a few miles from the Mississippi River. Locals refer to this area as the Wolf River Bottoms. As I drove, something in my peripheral vision caught my eye to the right. I saw a large black creature moving swiftly toward the front of my car. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes, thinking it might be a deer crossing the road. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The creature came to a screeching halt right in the middle of the road, just 7 feet from my bumper. We both froze, staring at each other for several seconds. The creature was 3 to 4 feet tall, but had a distorted appearance. It had a large head compared to its skinny, slender body, with dark gray and greenish skin similar to an alligator. Its eyes were large, oval-shaped, and glowed a rusty color, positioned where a human's nose would be. Below the eyes was a thin, dark line that looked like a mouth, running straight across its lower face before turning upward and slightly back on its head. Its arms were disproportionately long and thin, with insect-like joints, and its hands were folded at the wrists. The legs were also long and jointed like its arms, and I couldn't see any tail. The creature's chest moved slightly, as if it was breathing, but its movements were slow and steady. I didn't notice any signs of genitalia or hair, and it wasn't wearing any clothing. It looked skin-tight. Before I could react further, the creature took off like a shot, disappearing into the darkness. I could still make out its outline as it sprinted away, leaping over the guardrail and down the embankment with incredible speed. It was moving like a sprinter, far faster than any animal I had ever encountered. It vanished from sight almost instantly, leaving me in shock and disbelief. Throughout my career, I encountered a few bizarre incidents, but this was by far the strangest. I never told anyone on the force about the encounter, only sharing it with a close friend over the years. To this day, I can only identify it as a lizard man or an unknown humanoid. I would never have believed it unless I had actually witnessed it. Cycling in the woods. When my friend and I were between 10 and 13, summer weekends were reserved for cycling through the ancient woods near our suburban home in London. These woods were steeped in history, with old, ruinous manors from medieval times scattered throughout. Most of our memories from those days are happy, filled with laughter and adventure. But one evening stands out as particularly peculiar and terrifying. One summer evening, we ventured deep into the woods to explore an abandoned farm surrounded by towering pine trees at the center of the field. Reaching these trees required hopping over a couple of fences, but the sight of those majestic, isolated pines made the effort worthwhile. As we left the field, it was around 6 or 7 o'clock, still a crystal blue sky in England, with darkness not setting in until about 9 or 10 in the summer. Suddenly, an overwhelming sense of dread and panic washed over us. Without thinking, we pedaled as fast as we could toward the exit, which was a tunnel leading to the back road. A mere 5-minute ride from the pine trees, but something was terribly wrong. My friend vanished from sight, and it felt like minutes had stretched into hours. I slowed down and waited at the entrance of the tunnel, too scared to enter alone. Time seemed distorted as I stood there, anxiously waiting for him to reappear. Finally, he emerged, shaken and with no explanation for his disappearance. It felt as though 2 to 3 hours had compressed into 5 minutes, and daylight had flickered into dusk in an instant. That day, one of my brothers came into the house to alert the family. We stepped outside and heard a guttural roar, accompanied by relentless pounding on a wooden object. The evening was clear, warm, and still. No wind to explain the sounds. There was no moon to light our way. Neither my brother nor I could explain what was happening, and I remember being terrified out of my wits. After the sounds subsided, the family retreated inside, and the incident was never discussed with me again as a child. I was fortunate to live in such a remote, beautiful area, and to have the freedom to explore. Years later, my boyfriend and I witnessed what we were told must have been a bear in a thicket of alder trees near the house. The feces we found contained crotted shells and berry seeds with a horrible odor, but the creature we saw was not a bear. Its tracks were unlike any animal we knew. Our fathers were loggers, and we were well versed in local wildlife. Even though this happened a long time ago, I still get cold chills remembering those unexplained sounds. Hunted for sport. Park. A man once paid me to be hunted for sport. I had stumbled across this post when I was browsing the web for work. I was looking for some sort of side gig to pass the time. I was at a bit of a crossroads in my life. I had quit my previous job to break away from the redundancy it had sucked me into. It was a spontaneous decision with no real-life planning. Luckily, in this day and age, the internet caters to people like me, who don't care about chasing money or don't want to be tied down. It wasn't the money I was after, but the change it would provide. I felt like I couldn't enjoy anything in life. It was like I was just going through the motions. That night, I'd been scrolling for quite some time, skimming over job posts. Help wanted here, shorthanded. I didn't think I would find anything that would suit me. It all seemed like the same thing, disguised under different titles. That was until I found this particular ad. I thought it was a scam at first. Comical dollar signs on each side of the Craigslist title, like a trap set for the elderly in search of credit card numbers. I clicked on it anyway, curiosity getting the better of me. In all caps, the posting read, Vig moni ue for man huventi volumenti ears. At least it was to the point. The details below gave a brief introduction as to what the job entailed. I skimmed them over with amusement, half of me doubting if it was true, the other half kind of hoping it was. As ridiculous as the prospect was, I had to admit it was exciting. There were some requirements for the job, however, and I was surprised to find that I fit the bill. Must be male. Must be young and fit, if possible. Must not be afraid of the dark. Must come alone. No cell phones. No firearms. No police. The list went on for a while but ultimately ended with a phone number and a typed signature as someone simply named Bob. I found myself thinking it over. I didn't exactly have anything to lose. No family or friends. I had always lived alone. The idea of wanting to pack up at a moment's notice never seemed to sit well with any of the significant others I had in the past. I don't know if it was stupidity or the need for adventure, but in the end, I found myself grabbing my phone. I mean, how often do people get to say they were hunted for sport? The money wouldn't hurt either. I gave him a ring. The man who answered the call was tipsy but eager, and when I mentioned my interest in his post, he seemed to be ecstatic, like I was calling to give him the lead role in a movie. The conversation was a little awkward considering the reasoning behind the call itself, but after a few minutes of cryptic back and forth, we agreed on a meeting place. I was a few miles away, but he insisted I meet him closer to his side of the woods. The hunt would be at his estate, and I should stay in town so I was well rested for the event. We would meet at a local bar called the Sixth Shot to discuss terms and conditions. He seemed determined, like he had been waiting for someone for a while. He said he would understand if I was in no hurry, but with my current status of unemployment and lack of an overall plan, I found myself meeting his energy. I had to admit, the concept was a little exciting, if it was real at all. We decided to meet the next day. The Sixth Shot was a bustling little place. A neon sign with a smoking gun made it easy to find. When I arrived, I found the guy immediately. He looked about how you'd expect a manhunter to look. He pulled it off well. A black polo and tan cargo pants, a shiny shaved head with a thick curled mustache, all worn on a very tan and muscular body. He was sitting at the bar alone, and he lit up like a Christmas tree when he saw me, like he knew him. He patted the stool next to him, like he was welcoming a long-lost friend. When I crossed the bar, I was met with a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder. He told me he was delighted to meet me, and drinks were on him. After a brief introduction, he got a glass of top-shelf bourbon for himself, while I sipped on an Irish red ale. I had acquired a taste for it recently, considering he was trying to hire me with the intent to murder me. He seemed like a pretty cool guy. We got to know each other a little before getting to the serious stuff. The people around enjoyed their drinks, none the wiser. The man known as Bob was actually Robert Callahan, a man born into a world of wealth, and as it seemed, perpetual boredom. His father ran a very successful chain of automotive stamping companies that he inherited from his grandfather. By the time his father passed, there were so many buildings and people assigned to making the gears turn efficiently across the globe without his input. He was able to live a life of leisure on a 7-figure income without as much as lifting a finger. As he got older, he filled his adult years with seeking thrills across the globe. He tried anything that got his adrenaline pumping, from skydiving to whitewater rafting. He took a liking to hunting, which he said had started an escapade of finding the world's most dangerous predators and killing them no matter the cost. He said he had seen it all, but in all his years, there was one thing he hadn't bagged: a human. I laughed at his extraordinary lifestyle, feeling a bit mundane when it was my turn to share stories. Mine was far from exciting. I left the more boring bits out, but I told him I spent most of my 20s as a park ranger. It kept me close to nature and outdoors, but when it's all you look at, it tends to lose its luster. I left that to be a cab driver in the big city, something that kept me in transit and entertained for a while, always moving with so many people to observe in the busy city life. But in time, I found myself too contained to the city itself, which is why I recently quit. This brings me to about where I was right now, discussing being hunted by another man. He was fascinated, jotting down notes in a little pocketbook while he sipped his bourbon. We conversed for a time. I finished a couple of beers, and he ordered another pour of bourbon. Conversation was nice. It had been a while since the last time I went out with friends. Despite the fun I was having, we couldn't beat around the bush forever when it came time to discuss the actual terms of our agreement. His face turned serious. I would be paid $5,000 tonight, he said. Granted, I still want to go through with it. He said this would help me settle accounts before the event. He mentioned he owned a mansion outside of town with over 30 acres of forest land. It was outside city limits. His nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. No one would hear screams or gunshots. We would start tomorrow night. I was supposed to get to his estate at 10 p.m. After my arrival. I would get 15 minutes to head into the forest as a head start. When the 15 minutes were up, he would promptly signal with a flare. If I had any second thoughts, I needed to address them and withdraw from the woods before the signal. If I was still in the woods when the flare went off, I would be shot on sight. He said I would be paid $10,000 an hour if I survived. The hunt would go on till dawn, and if I was still alive come daybreak, I would be free. He would be armed with a hunting rifle and a combat knife. I would be armed with my wits. It was evident it wasn't in his plans for me to survive, but that was something I had already come to terms with. He studied my face when he said these things, perhaps trying to gauge my reaction. I tried my best to play it cool despite being a little nervous. "Does any of this bother you?" he eventually asked, downing the last of his drink. "No, not really. I've always just tried to go with the flow. Doing that made me stumble upon your offer. Maybe if I get out and live a little, it'll encourage me to settle down for a bit more. That is, if I make it out alive." I winked, and we both had a laugh. "Man, you're a riot. If I wasn't trying to kill you, I think we'd be pretty good friends." After all the details were ironed out, he paid the tab, and it was time for us to take our leave. We shook on it before going our separate ways. He was excited for the next day, a pep in step carrying him to his obnoxiously lifted truck. He burned out as he left, almost rear-ending a Buick as he left the parking lot. I watched him go, feeling oddly serene in the cool night air. It was hard to describe. There was no one waiting for me to come back, no one to give me a courtesy call if I didn't show up. I didn't know if it was the thrill of the challenge or the drastic break in monotony. I spent my life trying to not be a creature of habit. Maybe this would be the last shift. Or course, maybe tomorrow I would die and not have to worry about it anymore. With the moon shining bright and the cool breeze on my neck, I decided I would take a walk before sleeping in my car for the night. It might be my last time to enjoy a night like this. I woke the next day in the backseat of my car, feeling oddly rejuvenated despite my choice of bed for the night. Through the blinding afternoon rays, I found my phone and checked my bank account. He was a man of his word. The $5,000 had been wired as promised. I decided I would go into town and indulge in some of the local variety and find a place to shower before it was my time to meet Robert at the estate. I climbed into the front seat and left the bar parking lot. On my way into town, I called my landlord and canceled my lease. I was already living in and out of boxes, and my lease was month to month, so I wouldn't exactly be missed. After getting something to eat, I called and canceled all my utility accounts, electricity, internet, stuff like that. I already put in my resignation at the cab company. There weren't really any ties to my life or my apartment. I would either survive till dawn and get the biggest payday of my life, or not have to worry about the next step. Either way, this was the end of the current chapter of my life. After spending the day driving around town, I found myself heading over to Robert's property. The sun was already making its way into the horizon. His driveway was long and winding, leading to a gigantic house that looked like the surrounding forest was trying to swallow it. When I pulled up, it was already almost dark. A butler greeted me at the mansion, an old man carrying a silver tray covered in a soft cloth. He opened the car door and let me out, introducing himself only as Charles. "I will be taking your belongings now. If you don't make it out, they will be destroyed at sunrise." He helped with the tray, of course. I said, handing over my phone, wallet, and keys. After placing them on the tray, he offered a smile. "Would you like a refreshment before heading in, Mr. Callahan? I'll accommodate you before heading into the forest." He truly appreciates you answering his ad. "I'm fine, thank you. I guess I'd rather just get to it," I said, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. "Of course, if you will just follow me. It's right this way." He gestured for me to follow him. Charles escorted me through the house. The inside was furnished top to bottom in luxurious wooden furniture, Persian rugs, chandeliers made of gold, and paintings from the Renaissance era. The estate was definitely worth a fortune. We passed by a trophy room filled wall to wall with mounts of animals from across the globe. They seemed to stare with their glass eyes, following us as we made our way through. Charles made no effort to engage in conversation, and neither did I. The other end of the mansion consisted of a large patio waiting for us. There was Robert, who seemed to be preparing for the hunt. He was running a large combat knife over a wet stone slowly and methodically. As we approached, he propped up next to him was a rifle. The bolt was pulled back. Several cartridges laid out on a glass table next to it was the flare gun. "The time is approaching," said Charles, and Robert nodded. He wiped the blade off and sheathed it on his belt. I looked at his loadout on the table, starting to feel sick to my stomach. This was seriously happening now that I was here and seeing him fully prepared. I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. Robert stood and grabbed his rifle. He picked up each 308 cartridge and loaded them slowly, one at a time, until it was full. He racked the bolt forward, slung the rifle on his shoulder, and grabbed the flare gun. 15 minutes, then the flare, having second thoughts, he asked, twirling the flare gun on his finger. "No, not really," I said, making my way off the patio. I wasn't exactly sure what to say in a situation like this, so I figured it was best just to get going. "Excellent. I'll see you on the other side." He saluted me, and Charles gave me a nod. I turned and left the patio, making my way to the woods. Each step got heavier as I approached the trees, the darkness behind them getting eerier the closer I got. When I reached the tree line, I looked back at the mansion. Robert and Charles just watched expectantly. I swallowed and ducked in, feeling the full weight of my decision, perhaps a little too late. Once the mansion was no longer visible, I started jogging. I was mindful of my footsteps. A straight log or vine could trip me up. During my time as a park ranger, I spent dozens of hours hiking trails. I would survey the land weekly, picking up discarded things like trash and lost clothing. This landscape was much different, however. The ground was uneven, years of collecting leaves, buried fallen limbs, and jutting rocks. I was wearing decent boots, but the terrain was unforgiving. One misplaced step, and I could roll or break an ankle. I wouldn't be able to rush too much. If I could just maintain a steady pace, I would be able to put enough distance between us, and maybe find a decent place to hide. With the sun set and no light source, I couldn't see very far in front of me. I tried not to think about how much time had passed. I just focused on pushing forward. Ahead, the trees started to crowd, giant maples with lush branches blocking the moonlight that was trying to shine in. I ducked under them quickly. A twisted branch snagged my shirt, and I shook it loose. Birds screeched and roosted from their perch, flapping away in a panic at my presence. Their cries echoed into the night, sending a chill down my spine. There's nothing to be afraid of. I thought to myself, not yet, at least. I came to a small clearing and took a second to catch my breath. I leaned on a tree, shaking clumps of mud and pine needles from my boots. The ground was wetter than I had anticipated. Off in the distance behind me, there was an echoing pop, and I looked to see the flare reaching toward the sky. A little orange ball of fire. I pushed off the tree and continued. I had to keep moving. I ran across the clearing, each step squishing on the ground. On my third stride, my boot stepped on something awkward and hard, and by the time I heard the clicking sound, I knew it was already too late. The sudden force clamping down on both sides of my ankle. I could do nothing but cry in pain. I stumbled awkwardly to the ground, agony shooting at my leg as the wind was knocked out of me. I looked down at the bear trap, blood oozing from where the metal jaws were buried. I was frustrated at my foolishness. Of course, he had put traps in the woods. Why wouldn't he? I forced the jaws apart, the mechanism creaking, begging to bite down again. My hand shook, holding the slippery metal, and my leg was barely free. I let it snap shut. The steel-on-steel bite clanked into the night, the sound so loud it bounced off the trees. A second later, there was an excited wooing noise. He heard it. He would be coming. I tried to see my ankle in the dark. There were nasty gashes on either side, but I didn't think it was broken. I got back up. It would hold weight. It was just hurting like hell. I wanted to look back, but I pushed forward. Panic starting to set in. Trying to regulate my breathing, I moved as quickly as I could. One strong step, one baby limp. I scanned the ground, looking for more traps. There had to be more. Surely. Branches whipped my cheeks and pulled my clothes. I tried to be more careful, but just couldn't see them. Quick enough, my left foot squelched in its boot with every step, blood soaking through my sock into the laces. I pressed on, hurdling large dead logs. I had to find a spot to hide for a moment to catch my breath. My heart was racing. I was having trouble thinking rationally as I could with the situation. An icy feeling of fear washed over me. For the first time in a long time, I had gotten what I wanted, a thrill to make me feel alive. But as I looked down at my mangled leg, I was starting to regret it. Gunfire cracked in the distance. A branch next to my ear exploded, specks of bark and dust hitting my face from the racing bullet. I threw myself to the ground and started crawling, dragging my injured ankle with me. I dragged myself to a large pine tree and sat behind it, trying to come up with a plan. The gun went off again, closer this time. The round punched into the tree, shaking loose needles falling from above. I squinted in the dark, trying to see ahead. The ground started to slope, and I could faintly make out the sound of rushing water. Could be a creek or a small river. Keeping behind a large pine, I slowly stood, trying to stay concealed until I was ready. I pushed off and started to run for the slope, hearing the gunfire again. As soon as I was in view, a fierce pain ripped through my shoulder, and my arm went limp, but I wouldn't stop. I started down the hill. I could see the shimmering surface of the creek below. There was something bobbing in the water, rotted logs from the looks of it. I needed to get down there, get under the water, and use the logs as cover. I worked my way down the slope. The ground was wet, each step threatening to slide out from underneath me. There were footsteps now, breaking sticks and brushing trees, as they tried to catch up. Another gunshot. The bullet whizzed over my head and missed. I tried to go down further and crouch down, but my feet were too unstable. I focused on the water, limping closer and closer, like it was my salvation. I was almost there. Behind me, I could hear the rocking of the bolt action. I shot a panicked look behind me. I could barely see him working through the trees 20 yards away. As I turned back to the creek, my good foot got caught on something, and I fell forward. I hit the ground hard and started to roll painfully and awkwardly in the dark. I watched my descent and the swirl of moonlight and darkness, my elbows and knees clubbed by the earth as it went. I came to a stop at the edge of the water, lying on my back, gasping for air. I could hardly move, my vision spinning as I looked up at the sky. I could hear him coming down the hill, slowly and carefully. He knew he had won. He was taking his time now. Exhausted and defeated, I looked at the creek. It wasn't logs I had seen floating, but bodies, several of them bloating and rotted in the clear glow of the moon. The more I looked around, the more I saw. Men, women, children. I'm not sure what I expected. Robert was there now, boots squishing as he looked down at me. A pair of black goggles were over his eyes, a wicked grin on his face. He unslung his rifle and let it fall to the ground, then pulled the goggles off his face. He cast them aside like toys. Very disappointing. I thought, with you being a park ranger and all, you'd make it further, but here we are at the creek. They never make it past the creek. Robert cracked his knuckles and pulled the knife from his belt. He held the knife in both hands and brought it down, aiming for my heart. I put up my hands to fight him, but it only delayed the inevitable. He worked free from my grasp and elbowed me in the head, a blow that sent my vision blurring once more. My arms went slack, and he buried the knife in my chest, my lung collapsing as the blade went in. With a grunt, he pulled the blade down, separating my torso down the middle in a nasty, gushing mess. Satisfied, he got up and left me there to die. I tried to talk, but it all came out as gurgled whispers. What? What was that? He mocked, and he knelt to hear me. With the last of my breath, I spoke my last two words just loud enough for him to hear. Thank you. The involuntary screams came next. They were loud and trill, broken vocal cords shouting in a mixture of barking and screeching. With both hands, I pulled the large incision, yanking the flesh apart in a spray of blood and disintegrating organs. His reaction was the same as all the others before him, a look of pure, irrational fear. My thin, inky black limbs burst from the gaping wound in my torso, and I was on him in an instant, slashing the knife away and digging my nails into his flesh. I ripped his shirt like paper and separated his chest just like he did to me. My piercing screeches rang into the night until I burrowed so deep they could no longer be heard. He thrashed and oozed from every orifice as he made room for me, just as the cab driver did, and the park ranger before him. I ate and wriggled as he expired, warming and digging my tiny frame into each limb like a suit. When the fit was just right, I stood up and cracked my knuckles. I looked at my reflection in the water, running a hand over my new face to feel the fit better than the last one. For sure, I took my time going back to the estate, making sure my walk was just right, and everything was in place. The hours passed as I settled in, feeling more and more at home as I worked the joints and muscles. At daybreak, I emerged from the tree line to find Charles on the patio waiting. He came to greet me immediately. "Sir, this one had you out all night. Was this one better than the others? Can I get you something to drink?" "Oh, much better than the last," I replied. "And bourbon, if you will." Encounter on Highway 101. My fiancée and I were driving north on Oregon Highway 101 near Cape Perpetua, just north of Florence. The highway is a narrow two-lane road flanked by the vast Pacific Ocean to the west and steep rock cliffs to the east. I was admiring the moonlight reflecting off the ocean when a massive black creature suddenly rose from a cliff, towering over our little car. My fiancée screamed. What the hell was that? I only caught a glimpse of it through my peripheral vision. It was enormous and incredibly fast. Panicked, my fiancé searched for a place to turn around, wanting to head back, but I refused to let him go. We were armed with what seemed like small weapons given the size of the creature. As we cautiously approached the tunnel into the back road, I saw the creature again, its form dark and imposing against the moonlit backdrop. When we returned home, my fiancé shared the encounter with his father. He recounted a similar incident at a ranch at the foot of the Capes on Highway 101. The father had been checking on his cattle when he heard a cow bellowing in agony. His horse became nervous, but he continued and found a large hairy animal chewing on a live cow. Armed with a .30-06 rifle, he shot the creature. It stood up and ran off on two legs before disappearing into the rocky terrain, leaving only a trail of blood. This was the first time anyone had shot and wounded such a creature, and it was also the first time it was seen eating the meat of an animal. Our encounter happened on a clear full moon evening. My fiancé saw the creature in the headlights and had a clear view of it. He knew it wasn't a bear or a human pursuer. Its facial features lacked a snout, and its arms were too long for a bear's front legs. I was too terrified to make out any specific features. To this day, I've never experienced fear like that again. Crownland camping in Ontario. Camping in Ontario in early January was an isolated experience beside a large frozen lake. The temperature hovered around -8 degrees Celsius, but one day it rose above freezing after sunset. That night, the frozen lake began making eerie noises every few minutes, like a low-flying jet followed by a massive, slow bloop from the depths. Occasionally, a crack would shoot across the ice sheet, spanning half a kilometer in less than a second. My friends and I were initially freaked out, speculating about lake monsters or other mythical creatures. However, we later realized the sounds were natural, the fluid dynamics of the ice melting and shifting. Nevertheless, the experience was terrifying, especially since the day before we had been walking on the ice, unaware that it was weakening beneath us. The thought of falling through was a constant fear, reminding us of the raw, unpredictable power of nature. Ranger sighting in 2015. I've been working as a ranger for roughly 7 years. I can say that I generally love my career choice. However, sometimes you have to deal with things that are a little unorthodox. Besides that, it's a pretty normal career. And if you're an outdoorsy person like I am, it can be a lot of fun. But one sighting in the spring of 2015 stands out as particularly unsettling. A sighting of what I thought was a large humanoid reptilian creature. One evening, I parked my work truck at the back of our visitor's center parking lot and walked to the edge of the woods by a small stream flowing down the hillside. It was about 10 p.m., a pretty dark, clear night. The moon was not up, and the only light came from a dim backlight of the visitor center and my flashlight. I stood there for a few moments, playing with my flashlight and wandering my thoughts. I noticed a flat rock in the stream that I could use to cross. As I was about halfway across, I heard a loud rustling noise from below. My first thought was a deer, so I froze and listened. The rustling grew louder, turning into a loud crash into the trees. I had a distinct feeling that whatever it was heading towards me. I spun around and began to shine my light. There was nothing there, nothing visible. But then, I felt like I was being watched, like this thing was standing just beyond the line of light, silently observing me. I could see faintly glowing yellow eyes staring back at me with slits, like a large lizard. Fear overtook my entire body, and I knew in that moment I had to get out of there. Retreating back to the lot, I considered the possibility that other park rangers and people in other states have had similar sightings, so who knows? Maybe it wasn't a reptilian creature, maybe it was something else. Either way, it still really scared me. I just knew I had to leave immediately, never to return alone again. Boy Scout camp experience. When I was 11 or 12, I attended a Boy Scout camp in the Midwestern USA. One night, while talking with some friends in the tent, I decided to poke my head out through the flap to look outside. What I saw was totally bizarre and unsettling. We were deep in a forest, but I saw red lights moving all around, as though there were some kind of carnival in front of me. Some of the lights moved in circles or back and forth. One thing looked like an arrow with stripes, which was motionless at first, and then launched and bounced back and forth slightly, as though it were attached to a stiff spring. I was mesmerized by it, but I had no idea what on earth I was looking at. There were no people or anything unusual other than the red lights, and I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. Otherwise, it was just darkness and trees. I pulled my head back into the tent and told my friends I saw something weird. One of them poked his head out and said he saw it too, but he couldn't describe it and probably thought I was joking. I looked out again myself and saw someone's flashlight moving in the distance. They walked, but that wasn't anything out of the ordinary. To this day, I have no idea what that was about. My depth perception of the lights felt strange, as though I was seeing two images at the same time. The actual dark forest in front of me with a moving image of the light superimposed over it. I was skeptical of aliens and UFOs, but it definitely had me thinking about them. I told everyone about it the next day in detail, and nobody else had seen anything similar. It was just a weird thing that nobody could explain. Southern California incident. I tucked this away and never told anybody before. We live in Southern California, east of Los Angeles, and this incident occurred in 1996. My wife and I were leaving home early one morning. It was still dark as we were trying to get onto the major highway near our home, when we hit something coming out of a residential construction area. It ran extremely fast in front of the car. I had no time to stop, so I hit this thing. I came to a stop as soon as possible. I told my wife I was going to get out and take a look at what I hit. She begged me not to get out. I was sure that I had hit a dog. I stepped out, and as I rounded the car, the headlights of my car were shining upon something that I'd never seen before. It was disturbing. I backed up a little bit and realized what I had hit wasn't a dog. I have owned and trained large dogs for most of my life, but nothing compared to the size of this thing. Nothing about it resembled what I would say was a domesticated canine. Everything about this was wild and bulky. It had what looked like a lion's mane. It had teeth that looked like they came out of a Hollywood horror movie. I can't even begin to describe the fright I had in seeing this thing. I backed up a bit more. I could see its teeth were unusually big and sharp, and there was a pool of blood forming underneath its mouth. Its eyes were open, but it wasn't moving. I could still see the bright amber eye color. My wife stepped out of the car and asked, "What is it?" I said, "I don't know." We got in. I backed up and drove around it. I said, "If it's still there when we get back home, we'll take a closer look later." That day, when we got back, it was gone. A dry pool of blood was the only evidence that remained to this day. We kept quiet about the incident. So 26 years later, I now felt compelled to come forward, not because I feel guilty about the experience, but because I had another unexplained sighting. We live in the same home as we did when the previous incident occurred. One evening, I was a few blocks away from my house going through a house that I was getting ready to sell. I am a realtor and in the real estate business. When I was finished, I exited the front door of the house, walked to my car that was parked in the driveway, and got in. As I backed up into the street, I observed a large upright beast cross behind me. I immediately stopped and looked out the passenger window. This creature was running on two legs in between the house and the neighbor's property. I sat in the car, dumbfounded by what I just witnessed. Then I had a flashback to the incident in 1996. I quickly realized that this was either the same creature or something very similar. That was the last time I saw this creature, but now I realize that there is an unknown upright canine-like beast living in the area. Thinking back to the latest encounter, I estimate that it easily stood 8 feet in height, and it had a very human-like gait when it was running. I have read your posts about dogmen and upright canines, and I now believe that this is what I witnessed on both occasions. If I see it again, I will inform you. Encounter with a mountain lion in rural Missouri. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go canoeing through the remote areas of rural Missouri. We spent the day navigating the peaceful river, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the surrounding woods. As evening approached, it became clear that it was getting dark, and we were too far downstream to paddle back to the nearest resort. With no cell service available, we decided to set up camp on the riverbank. Our dog, a lively puppy named Rocky, was with us, keeping watch as we unpacked our gear. As night fell, the forest grew silent, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures filling the air. But something felt off that night. The stillness was unnerving, and the darkness seemed to press in around us. Around midnight, we heard a rustling sound near our campsite. At first, we thought it was just an animal searching for food, but the noise was too deliberate, too heavy. Rocky started growling, his body tense and alert. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was a fox or a raccoon, but the sounds persisted, growing louder and more frequent. Suddenly, something charged the side of our tent, pulling out 2 tent stakes. The force was intense, shaking the entire structure. My heart raced as I realized we were dealing with something much more dangerous. Rocky barked fiercely, his protective instincts kicking in, but I could see the fear in his eyes as he tried to ward off the unseen threat. We stayed huddled inside the tent, too terrified to move, listening as whatever it was prowled around us. The creature made no noise apart from its heavy footsteps and the rustling of the tent fabric as it tried to get inside. We couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the presence was undeniable. After what felt like hours, the sounds subsided, and the creature moved away, leaving us shaken and terrified. I don't know how we survived that night. We barely slept, consumed by fear and adrenaline. The next morning, we found our tent in disarray. The stakes pulled out, and the fabric torn. Rocky was shaken but unharmed. The encounter left us with a deep respect for the dangers that lurk in the wilderness and a lingering fear of what might be watching us from the shadows. It was a stark reminder that even in the most peaceful settings, the wilderness holds its own mysterious and potentially deadly secrets. Jasper National Park missing camper. In 2007, I served as a ranger in St. Louis County, Minnesota. During a routine lunch break, a fellow ranger, a devoted husband and father, went missing along with one of our staff members. We launched a search party, combing the rugged terrain for over a day, but there was no sign of them. We extended our search to nearby towns, but no one had seen anything. Assuming he had wandered off and possibly perished, we respected the family's wish to locate and bury his remains, a task we honored with solemn dedication. Months passed, and the incident faded from our daily concerns. That was until one eerie fall evening changed everything. I was patrolling the rural roads, monitoring the area with my radar equipment. About 2 miles north of town, I noticed a pair of glowing eyes in a ditch. Initially, I thought it was a fox or some other animal. I stopped the vehicle and stepped out to investigate. What I saw next froze me in place. A dark, shadowy figure hunched over a freshly killed 4-point buck. The creature was feasting on the deer, its movements deliberate and unnatural. As I watched, it stood upright on 2 legs, turning its blood-red eyes directly toward me. Before I could react, it vanished into the nearby creek, leaving only the haunting memory of those glowing eyes. Days turned into weeks, but that vision haunted me. I saw the figure again in the same secluded area, always lurking but never aggressive. Each encounter was brief, but the presence was unmistakable. The final sighting was the most unsettling. The creature stood tall, its red eyes fixed on mine before it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. It never attacked, but its mere existence in that remote area was chilling. The mystery of the missing ranger and the enigmatic figure remained unresolved, leaving me with a lingering sense of dread every time I patrolled those woods. Shadow person encounters. Over the years, I've had my fair share of unnerving encounters with shadowy figures and unexplained phenomena. Each experience has left me questioning reality and the unseen forces that might lurk just beyond our perception. One of my most memorable encounters happened during my longest hike ever, a grueling 26-mile trek. At the end of the trail, I stumbled upon a giant nighttime computer monitor standing alone in the darkness. The idea of carrying such a bulky device through rough terrain seemed absurd, and what made it stranger was that there was no actual computer connected to it. The purpose of the monitor remained a mystery, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the deserted trail. Another chilling night occurred while camping in an old mining ghost town with a friend. A seemingly ordinary house cat began stalking us relentlessly. Given the area's reputation for bears, wolves, and mountain lions, we couldn't fathom how a domestic cat survived so well in the harsh wilderness. To make matters worse, an abandoned car along the hiking trail kept flipping over every time we passed by. The situation escalated when a late-night heron rookery started producing primal guttural noises that sounded straight out of a horror movie. I was frozen in fear, convinced that some monstrous beast would tear open my tent and devour me. It turned out to be nothing more than a flock of large birds and their chicks, but the fear lingered long after. As a child, I had a terrifying encounter in my backyard in the late 90s or early 2000s. My cousin and I were playing on the swing set when a large hairy spider with fly-like wings landed on the beam above me. I screamed, and we both ran inside in a panic. My cousin doesn't remember the spider, likely because she couldn't see it from her side of the swing. My uncle, a scientist, dismissed it as no known animal, but without the internet, I couldn't look it up. Now, as an adult, I believe what I saw was a cryptid, an undiscovered species with wings. This encounter sparked my lifelong interest in the paranormal and unexplained phenomena. More recently, while fishing on a small public pier at an inland bay, I noticed a silhouette in the murky water a few meters away. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Later that night, I saw it again as I backed up into the street, an upright, shadowy figure running on two legs. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with a human-like gait and glowing red eyes. The creature mirrored the one I had seen years ago, making me believe that an unknown canine-like beast roamed the area. In Melbourne National Park, during a patrol in 2015, I encountered a large humanoid reptilian creature. After months of searching for a missing ranger, I was patrolling 2 miles north of town when I spotted a pair of blood-red eyes in the ditch. What I saw next was beyond comprehension. A shadowy figure hunched over a deer, finishing it off. It stood on 2 legs, faced me directly, and then disappeared into a creek. I saw it again in the same area, always present but never aggressive. The final encounter was the most terrifying, as its blood-red eyes locked onto mine before it vanished completely. These experiences have left me deeply unsettled, always on edge during patrols and hikes. Whether it's shadow people, cryptids, or other supernatural entities, the unknown forces in the wilderness continue to haunt me, reminding me that not all mysteries can be easily explained. Fishing pier encounter. Last Sunday, I decided to go fishing at an inland bay. It was around 50 degrees, so I didn't expect much, but I love fishing regardless of the conditions. I arrived at the bay around noon and settled onto the small public pier. I spent about an hour watching the wildlife and keeping an eye on my fishing pole, enjoying the peacefulness of the water. After a while, something unusual caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. A silhouette stood just a couple of meters away from me, almost blending into the murky bay. I snapped my head towards it, but by the time I turned fully, it was gone. Intrigued by the possibility of encountering a shadow person, a phenomenon I'm familiar with, and even inspired by the movie John Bass at the end, I decided to see if I could catch another glimpse. I spent the next 45 minutes pacing back and forth on the pier, meticulously checking my rod for any bites while trying not to stare directly where I thought I saw the figure. Nothing appeared, so I abandoned my ghost hunt and focused on fishing. However, around 3:40 a.m., I saw it again. This time, I was more prepared. I tried to keep it in my peripheral vision and slowly turned my attention toward it, but it vanished once more. I began to look around for rational explanations. There was a trash can about 4 feet away, but I was fully aware of it the entire time. Nearby was a fishing line recycling receptacle, but it was white and much closer, while the figure I saw was darker and taller. Determined to understand what I was witnessing, I spent another 20 minutes searching the pier, but it remained elusive. As the weather began to change and rain seemed imminent, I decided to pack up. Walking down the boardwalk over the marsh, I noticed something else strange. The marsh grass near me was bending and moving, while the rest of the grass remained still despite the lack of wind. Curious, I stopped to investigate, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. The movement in the grass was exaggerated, almost as if something large was passing by. After a few seconds, the grass settled, leaving me more intrigued but still needing to leave. I continued back to my truck, passing a giant mound of dirt in the public park, likely a former landfill. From atop the hill, I turned to take one last look at the bay, and there it was, a shadow person standing about 200 yards away on the pier. I quickly reached for my phone, but by the time I looked, the specter had vanished. I don't claim this is undeniable proof of anything supernatural, but the experience was undeniably strange. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me, but given that half my platoon witnessed shadow people in Afghanistan, I believe these phenomena are real, though likely rare. This encounter added a mysterious layer to my otherwise mundane life, leaving me with questions that still linger. Southern California incident. Living east of Los Angeles in Southern California, my wife and I had a terrifying encounter in 1996 that I kept to myself for years. One early morning, still enveloped in darkness, we were trying to merge onto a major highway near our home when something inexplicably darted out of a residential construction area and raced across the road in front of our car. The creature was moving so fast that I had no time to react, causing us to slam on the brakes and come to an abrupt stop. Instinctively, I told my wife that I needed to get out and check what we had hit, convinced it was a dog. She pleaded with me not to, but my curiosity and concern overrode her objections. As I stepped out of the car, the beam of our headlights illuminated a sight that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't a dog. This creature was nothing like any domesticated canine I had ever known. It was wild and bulky, with a mane resembling that of a lion and teeth that seemed ripped from a Hollywood horror movie. The sight was so horrifying that I couldn't even begin to articulate the fear it instilled in me. Backing up, I realized the creature had been severely injured. Its teeth were unusually large and sharp, and there was a pool of blood forming beneath its mouth. Its eyes, a bright amber, were wide open, yet it remained motionless, staring lifelessly at us. My wife stepped out of the car and asked, "What is it?" I could only respond, "I don't know." Without another moment's hesitation, I reversed the car to get away, telling my wife that if it was still there when we returned home, we'd take a closer look later. When we got back, the creature was gone, leaving only a dried pool of blood as evidence. We never discussed the incident further, keeping the terrifying encounter to ourselves. 26 years later, the memory of that night resurfaced when I had another unexplained sighting. As a realtor, I was preparing to sell a house a few blocks away from our home. Exiting the front door and approaching my parked car in the driveway, I witnessed a large upright beast running on 2 legs between our house and the neighbor's property. The creature's human-like gait and towering 8-foot height mirrored the terror I felt back in 1996. Immediately, I was struck by the realization that this was either the same creature or something very similar. The memory of the 1996 incident and the lifeless amber eyes now made sense. it dawned on me that there might be an unknown, upright canine-like beast inhabiting the area, an entity that had left an indelible mark on both of our lives. These experiences have reshaped my understanding of the unknown, making me believe in the existence of dogmen or other upright canines that defy conventional explanations. The fear and awe I felt witnessing these creatures have stayed with me, a constant reminder that some mysteries remain unsolved, lurking in the shadows of our everyday lives. Alaskan Wilderness Encounter. Working in the oil industry on the north slope of Alaska exposed me to some of the most untamed and unforgiving wilderness on Earth. The Alaska Petroleum Reserve stretches for hundreds of miles, accessible only via long ice roads constructed in the harsh winter months. Our mission was to support exploration drilling pads by testing rock formations for oil production, a job that took about a week. Deep in the wilderness, about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, our journey back to camp was nearing its end. It was mid-January, and the sun had yet to rise in what felt like an eternity of polar night. Our ice road patrol was routine, checking in and out of guard shacks at the beginning and end of the roads for safety, as there was no cell reception and radios had limited range. Around 4 in the morning, as we were halfway across the ice road, travel was slow due to the road's 25 miles per hour speed limit when anything unusual appeared. Suddenly, something appeared on the road in our headlights, a man dressed in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie jacket, walking alone on a pristine rocky path. It was 10:04 a.m., 20 degrees outside, an unusual time for a lone hiker in such extreme weather. The local Inuit people often ventured this far. Perhaps a snowmobile had broken down, so we thought he might be lost. However, the man's demeanor was off. His face was blank, devoid of any emotion or thought, as he continued shuffling forward without acknowledging us. Frustrated and concerned, one of my crew members in the cab decided to take action. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the man, intending to shake him out of whatever stupor he was in. Suddenly, the man spun around and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm, glaring at us with pure rage. If emotions had a physical presence, his anger could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned in pain as the man tried to pull him out of the truck. At that moment, the man let out a blood-curdling scream, filled with hate, rage, and anger. Terrified, I slammed on the gas, spinning out on the ice and launching him forward. Despite my efforts, the man remained attached, desperately trying to pull my buddy from the vehicle. The scene was chaotic. My buddy's arm was sore, showing bruises in the shape of a hand, but he eventually managed to tear free. We rushed to the guard shack another 30 miles down the road, breathless and shaken. Reporting what had happened, we were met with skepticism. The guard insisted they had searched the ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and found nothing, not even tracks. He suggested it was a prank, though the severity and reality of the encounter left us unconvinced. How could someone fabricate such a terrifying story and willingly bruise their arm? To this day, we never received a satisfying explanation for that night. The Alaskan tundra is a strange place, and that encounter remains one of the many bizarre stories from my time in the wilderness. It serves as a reminder that in the vast, uncharted expanses of Alaska, not all mysteries can be easily explained, leaving us to ponder the true nature of what we encountered that night. Coast Guard Tugboat Encounter. Serving as a Coast Guard officer on the SDS Striker, an old Navy tug repurposed for modern missions, was an experience filled with both routine and the unexplained. The tugboat was said to be haunted by the ghost of a Navy engineer who had tragically died from gas exposure during construction. Most of us dismissed it as sailor lore, but strange occurrences kept the legend alive. One evening, a new mechanic was struggling to fix one of the ship's batteries. Frustrated, he couldn't get the connections right despite multiple attempts. A seasoned crew member, dressed in a Navy uniform, stepped in and said, "No, you do it like this." He expertly unscrewed and reassembled the battery, demonstrating the correct procedure. Once done, the man in uniform left the area, and we never saw him again. Despite recognizing him from past crew members, this particular engineer had never returned after that port call, leaving us uncertain about what had transpired. Adding to the eerie atmosphere were the occasional screams of a woman heard during late-night shifts. These sounds were so unsettling that we made it a habit to turn the boats aft, away from the direction of the screams, fearing it might be a distressed civilian in the water. However, there was never any evidence of a woman aboard or in the vicinity when we investigated. Using high-powered lights to search those sections of the ocean yielded nothing, only amplifying the mystery. The screams persisted, yet no one was ever able to log the events officially. We were instructed to remain silent about these disturbances, adding an extra layer of fear and mystery to our nightly patrols. The presence of the ghostly engineer, combined with the unexplained screams, created an environment where the line between reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving us to navigate our duties under the watchful eyes of unseen forces. These experiences on the SDS Straker reinforced the unsettling belief that some spirits never find peace, lingering on the vessels they once served, haunting the very places they knew best. Class camping trip. Sleepwalking friend. Back in 6th grade, our class went on a camping trip that left a lasting impression on me. The boys were assigned to bunk beds in a rustic cabin, enjoying their first real overnight adventure away from home. It was past 11 p.m., and the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a loud banging noise followed by intense yelling. It took me a moment to realize it was one of my close friends, a quiet, kind-hearted kid known for his gentle nature. Instead of comforting words, he was flipping tables, throwing chairs, and screaming uncontrollably like a wild animal. His eyes were wide open, devoid of any emotion, staring lifelessly into the moonlight. The sight was horrifying, making me feel like a demonic force had taken over him, turning him into a vessel for supernatural violence. Panicked and terrified, I watched as the chaos unfolded. The camp guides were eventually called and managed to subdue him, removing him from the cabin. The other boys, now wide awake, were left in a state of fear and confusion, having no understanding of what had just transpired. The next morning, we learned that our friend had experienced a severe sleepwalking episode. His mother explained that his sleepwalks were often violent, a side of him that none of us had fully seen before. While it was a relief to know there was a logical explanation, the memory of his possessed, lifeless eyes under the moonlight remains haunting. It was a terrifying experience that seemed to bridge the gap between reality and the unknown, leaving me with an eerie sense that there are forces beyond our comprehension capable of taking control when we least expect it. This incident not only scared me but also sparked a lifelong fascination with the unexplained and the mysteries of the human mind. To this day, the image of my friend's terrified, empty eyes continues to linger in my memory, a reminder of how fragile our control over reality can be. Coast Guard tugboat encounter. Serving as a Coast Guard officer on the SDS Straker, an old Navy tug repurposed for modern missions, was an experience filled with both routine and the unexplained. The tugboat was said to be haunted by the ghost of a Navy engineer who had tragically died from gas exposure during construction. Most of us dismissed it as sailor lore, but strange occurrences kept the legend alive. One evening, a new mechanic was struggling to fix one of the ship's batteries. Frustrated, he couldn't get the connections right despite multiple attempts. A seasoned crew member, dressed in a Navy uniform, stepped in and said, "No, you do it like this." He expertly unscrewed and reassembled the battery, demonstrating the correct procedure. Once done, the man in uniform left the area, and we never saw him again. Despite recognizing him from past crew members, this particular engineer had never returned after that port call, leaving us uncertain about what had transpired. Adding to the eerie atmosphere were the occasional screams of a woman heard during late-night shifts. These sounds were so unsettling that we made it a habit to turn the boats aft, away from the direction of the screams, fearing it might be a distressed civilian in the water. However, there was never any evidence of a woman aboard or in the vicinity when we investigated. Using high-powered lights to search those sections of the ocean yielded nothing, only amplifying the mystery. The screams persisted, yet no one was ever able to log the events officially. We were instructed to remain silent about these disturbances, adding an extra layer of fear and mystery to our nightly patrols. The presence of the ghostly engineer combined with the unexplained screams created an environment where the line between reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving us to navigate our duties under the watchful eyes of unseen forces. These experiences on the SDS Straker reinforced the unsettling belief that some spirits never find peace, lingering on the vessels they once served, haunting the very places they knew best. Backcountry camping and unexplained sounds. One fall, my friends and I paddled into a favorite backcountry campsite high on a rocky cliff. The natural stairs provided easy access, shielding us from the wind and dampness of the nearby lake. The area was surrounded by exposed rocks that formed natural trails, making our exploration enjoyable and adventurous. That day, while walking through the woods behind our campsite, we ventured into open spaces created by the rocky terrain. The trail was quiet, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We weren't far from the site when we suddenly heard the slow approach of a vehicle behind us. My stepdad, always the vigilant one, signaled us to move aside and let it pass. His urgency and confusion made it clear that something was amiss. As the vehicle drove by, we expected to see a Forest Ranger's 4x4 or a rugged Land Rover. Instead, a peculiar station wagon-like car with an unusually long body and a massive trunk caught our attention. The back window was filled with large black trash bags, tied up tightly and suspiciously. To a teenager, this was alarming for several reasons. Such a car wasn't designed for off-road trails, and we had never encountered any vehicles on this bike road before. The driver didn't stop for directions and seemed unfriendly, dressed in dark clothing with short hair and a stern demeanor. The car continued past us without a second glance, but the unease lingered. My stepdad, ex-Army and one of the toughest guys I knew, remained serious as he assessed the situation. Moments later, the reverse lights of the car illuminated the path as it began to back up toward us. Panic set in immediately. He yelled for us to run. Without even getting on our bicycles, we bolted on foot, racing through the woods with our bikes in tow, desperately seeking safety. We ran until we reached a railway bridge we had passed earlier, and only then did we stop to catch our breath. We never looked back, unsure if the man in the car had tried to pursue us or continued driving. The fear that day left a lasting impression, especially seeing how my stepdad reacted. We never discussed the incident further, but it left me wary of who, or what, we might encounter in the woods. This wasn't the only strange event in Nacogdoches. During a deep Jeep trip in the middle of winter, my sway bar's quick disconnects became loose, and no tool seemed to fix them. Out of nowhere, a man appeared, offering exactly the tool we needed to tighten it. He was hiking alone in the desolate wilderness, yet after helping us, he simply walked away and never returned to the tugboat, leaving us to wonder about his true nature. Another eerie night occurred during a camping trip with a friend in the same remote area. It was pitch dark, and we went to bed around 11 p.m. Later, we both saw a bright white light flicker through the roof of our tents. No sound, no movement, just an inexplicable glow. Though we tried to rationalize it, and eventually fell asleep, the memory of that light remains unsettling. From 2014 to 2019, despite camping frequently in that area, that was the only night we experienced something so inexplicable. These encounters have left me cautious and ever aware of the unknown elements that can inhabit even the most serene wilderness, reminding me that the woods hold secrets we may never fully understand. Shadow person in Melbourne National Park. During my patrols as a ranger in Melbourne National Park, I've had my share of unexplained encounters, but none as unsettling as the one I experienced in the spring of 2015. One night, I parked my work truck at the back of our visitor's center parking lot and decided to take a walk to the edge of the woods, near a small stream flowing down the hillside. It was around 10 p.m., a pitch-dark, clear night with the moon absent, leaving only a faint glow from the visitor center and the beam of my flashlight to illuminate my path. I wandered near the stream, playing with my flashlight and enjoying the solitude. Spotting a flat rock, I used it as a stepping stone to cross the shallow water. Midway across, a loud wrestling noise echoed from beneath the surface. My immediate thought was that a deer might be struggling, so I froze and listened intently. The sounds intensified, morphing into a loud crash that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. A chilling sense of being watched enveloped me. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing visible, only darkness and the dense foliage. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw faint, glowing yellow eyes staring directly at me, slits reminiscent of a large lizard. The sight was horrifying, and fear gripped every fiber of my being. Instinctively, I knew I had to leave immediately. I retreated back to the parking lot, my heart pounding, feeling a mix of terror and disbelief. Only later did I realize that similar sightings were shared by other rangers in different states, suggesting that this phenomenon wasn't isolated to Yellowstone. Yet, the creature I encountered felt uniquely menacing, leaving me questioning whether it was a reptilian entity or something entirely different. The incident didn't end there. In the winter, with about 12 inches of snow covering the ground, I saw the creature again. This time, it was clearer, standing upright, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. Relieved when spring arrived, and I no longer had to patrol that section of the park, I couldn't shake the belief that what I saw was more than just a wild animal. I began to theorize that Ranger John, who had gone missing months earlier and was found brutally killed, had his spirit transformed into this ghastly apparition, possibly a Wendigo. This theory, though wild, offered a semblance of explanation for the encounters. The idea that Ranger John's spirit became an embodiment of the creature I saw gave me some peace, linking his untimely death to the malevolent entity haunting the woods. The notion of spirits transforming into supernatural beings is a chilling concept, one that blurred the line between reality and legend for me. I share this story in hopes of hearing your thoughts and theories. Do you believe that Ranger John could have transformed into a Wendigo? Is it possible that his spirit manifested as the creature I encountered? The experience has left me with more questions than answers, but it remains one of the most unnerving moments of my career as a ranger. Longest hike encounter. During the summer of my 20s, I embarked on my longest hike ever, a grueling 26-mile trek through the remote wilderness. The trail was unforgiving, filled with steep inclines and rocky terrain that tested both my endurance and resolve. As dusk began to settle in, I reached the end of the trail and stumbled upon something completely unexpected. A giant, nighttime computer monitor standing alone in a clearing. The idea of someone carrying such a bulky device through this harsh landscape seemed absurd. There was no computer connected to it, leaving me puzzled about its purpose. The monitor simply stood there, silently watching, as if waiting for something or someone. Later that night, my friend and I set up camp in an old mining ghost town nearby. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the sounds of wildlife. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions were common in this area. However, one night, a regular house cat began stalking us relentlessly. It was odd how it seemed so persistent and unusual in this wild environment, raising questions about how it had survived so well. Our encounters didn't stop there. On another hike, we came across an old abandoned car on the trail. Every time we passed by, it was inexplicably flipped over again. It was on a hiking path, adding to the mystery of who or what could be tampering with it. These oddities made us question the normalcy of our surroundings. One particular night remains etched in my memory. My friend and I were camping near a great blue heron rookery late into the evening. As we settled into our tents, The sounds of the wilderness were overtaken by the most primal, guttural alien noises I've ever heard. Sounds straight out of Jurassic Park. I was frozen in my sleeping bag, terror-stricken at the thought of some monstrous beast tearing open my tent and devouring me. Eventually, desperation got the better of me, and I unzipped my tent to pee, heart pounding. To my astonishment, the horrifying sounds were merely a bunch of big birds and their babies chattering away in the trees above. The fear was all in my head, but it was a terrifying reminder of how the mind can play tricks in the darkness. Another eerie memory from my childhood involves a night in the late 90s or early 2000s. My cousin and I were playing on my backyard swing set when we heard a loud buzzing sound. Looking up, I saw what I can only describe as a tarantula or a tarantula-like spider. It was a big hairy spider with large fly-like wings that had landed on the beam supporting the swing. The sight was so bizarre that we both screamed and ran inside, causing a commotion. My cousin doesn't remember the spider, likely because it was out of her view, but I vividly recall the winged arachnid. I often asked my uncle, a scientist, about flying spiders, but he dismissed it as no known animal. It wasn't until recently, at 29, that I realized what I saw might be considered a cryptid, an undiscovered species. This encounter fueled my lifelong fascination with the unknown and the paranormal, leading me to believe in experiencer stories of strange creatures like ATS and Bigfoot. Fishing pier encounter. Last Sunday, I decided to go fishing at an inland bay, despite the chilly 50-degree weather. I enjoy fishing regardless of the conditions, so I made my way to the small public pier around noon. Settling down with my gear, I spent about an hour watching the wildlife and keeping a close eye on my fishing pole, enjoying the tranquility of the bay. Around the time I thought I might call it a day, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. A silhouette standing just a couple of meters away from me. It surprised me, so I snapped my head in that direction, but the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. Intrigued by the possibility of encountering a shadow person, a phenomenon I'm familiar with and inspired by the movie John Bass at the End, I decided to see if I could catch another glimpse. For the next 45 minutes, I paced back and forth at the end of the pier, meticulously checking my rod for any bites, while being careful not to stare directly where I thought I saw the figure. Nothing appeared, so I abandoned my ghost hunt and focused on fishing instead. But around 3:40 a.m., as the night deepened, I saw the silhouette again. This time, I was more prepared, trying to keep it in my peripheral vision, while slowly turning my attention toward it. However, it disappeared before I could get a clear look. Determined to understand what I was witnessing, I scanned my surroundings for rational explanations. There was a trash can about 4 feet away, which I was fully aware of the entire time, and a fishing line recycling receptacle nearby. The figure I saw was darker and much taller than either of these objects, making it impossible to attribute to them. Undeterred, I spent another 20 minutes pacing the pier, searching for whatever it could have been. But again, it remained elusive. As the weather began to change and rain seemed imminent, I decided to pack up and leave. Walking down the boardwalk over the marsh, I noticed something else unusual. The marsh grass near me was bending and moving, while the rest remained still despite the lack of wind. Intrigued, I stopped to investigate, suspecting my mind was playing tricks on me. The movement in the grass was exaggerated, almost as if something large had passed by. After a few seconds, the grass settled, but the unease lingered. I continued back to my truck, passing a giant mound of dirt in the public park, likely a former landfill. From atop the hill, I turned to take one last look at the bay. And there it was, a shadow person standing about 200 yards away on the pier. I quickly reached for my phone to capture the image, but by the time I turned back, the specter was gone. The encounter left me with more questions than answers, reinforcing my belief in the reality of shadow people, though I recognize they are likely rare phenomena. The experience added a mysterious layer to my otherwise mundane life, reminding me that some mysteries remain unsolved, lurking in the shadows of our everyday lives.